Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that I'm afraid doesn't have a joke this week because we need to talk about something that's very serious. I know everyone you've been listening to will have been talking about this, but I'm sorry, there's no fun intro to this episode this week because we couldn't think of anything that would be. Yeah, there just isn't anything we can say. I don't think levity is helpful right now. This is a serious topic, so I suppose we're going to go straight into our topic this week, which, Rob, do you want to fill us in on the kind of timeline of events here?
Yeah, so we'll be focusing on, the scope of the worldwide Black Lives Matter protests that have been with us for about the last 2 weeks now, I'd say, since we last recorded. This movement has really gained some momentum. And I just wanted to bring it back about how it all started. The first event sort of happened on May the 25th when George Floyd died after a police arrest. The reason why this death resonated with so many people is that it was filmed online. Quite a harrowing scene of a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, who knelt on George's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while George essentially pleaded for his life and told the man to get off his neck. The phrase that has captured the public imagination is this one: "I can't breathe." What's also kind of harrowing about that footage, I feel, is that there is a second police officer with him who does nothing despite his cries. And then after this, George is pronounced dead later, and no action is seen to be taken against the police officers who portrayed that act. And it only takes a day for protests to start to begin in Minneapolis, some peaceful and some turning more violent as people start to take their anger out on the local police force, which I think we'll go into a lot more detail about the reasons behind this, and maybe now is a good reason to start going on about this. But I think it's George Floyd's death is the spark that ignites this protest, but it's certainly not the first thing that's happened like this in the Black community, in particular in America. Yeah, I think that's probably what we want to deal with tonight.
Yeah. And I think there's maybe some important framing here. I'm not an American, obviously, but for as this is a British podcast that's generally going out to British listeners, it is true that the way things are handled in the US is a bit different. Like, obviously, their police have guns. This was an event that did not involve someone being shot, but obviously that happens far too often because you can't unpull the trigger of a gun. And in the past, situations like that there's various protections that I haven't fully got my head around listening to other podcasts on the topic for the police in the US that are different to how things work here. And also police is much more locally run in the US. I mean, like, we have the Met over here and then we have other police services, but there's still kind of an overall like police commission and board and stuff. And I get the impression that it's at most handled at a state level over in the US. There's no federal police in that regard. You have things like the National Guard that are a completely separate entity and not police. So that's one difference to bear in mind while we're talking about these things. And the other thing is, I do think we have a tendency in the UK to be like, oh, well, we're better than America. Like, they've got problems with racism and we're aware of it, but we're so good at this over here. And we're not. I think there's a lot of stuff that we'll come on to and touch on. Like, just because our police officers don't have guns doesn't mean there aren't problems like institutionalized racism. And it's not just in the police. So I think just to frame this up front, like, we're not here to say America is the only place that's got this wrong. Like that there will be points we come into that tie into how the protests have moved worldwide. This is bigger than the America problem. It just so happens that this current focus is centered on this event that happened there, because I think the key thing here is that 8 minutes 46 seconds. It was so egregious. You had people who in the past in the US would have defended and said, oh, in the moment this police officer pulled a gun. And there's this kind of, I'm going to forget the name of the law now because I literally listened to a podcast about this today, but there's a law whereby if you can say, like, in that 2-3 seconds where someone pulled the trigger, that they feared for their life, well then, I think qualified immunity, as the chat says, is probably the thing, but I didn't want to say for definite. this idea that in that 3 or 4 seconds when the trigger is pulled, if the police officer feared for their life, then it's a reasonable use of force in the American legal system, and therefore it's not illegal because that's how they cover using guns in these situations. This situation obviously didn't have a gun involved, and it's just such an egregious and like at no point during that 8 minutes 46 seconds did this officer go, oh, maybe I'm going a bit harsh on this. Like, and I think that's why this has been such a clear example of the problems, because the initial response was really bad. The initial response from the police service was like, oh, well, you know, pending investigation, that kind of stuff. And then like there's been we'll go into this in detail, I suppose, but there's been a progression of the charges brought against the officers involved. But it's like, I think this is one of those times where it's cut across a large swathe of the American public, where people who might previously have been like, oh, well, you know, the police were using reasonable force, that guy was obviously X or Y, that it's very clear here that this was a sustained, sorry, I'm struggling with words, but like it's very clear over 8 minutes of having having a knee on someone's neck is just not, like, I think everyone can see that and go, that's wrong. And that's why this has started as a really powerful focus for this ongoing series of events that's carried on, and we'll talk about in more detail as we go on.
Yeah, I think in particular you've got also like the nature of the crime that he was alleged to have committed. It was for handing over a counterfeit bill, wasn't it?
A counterfeit $20 bill was the accusation, and I think, I don't see how you could defend the idea that killing someone is a reasonable response to having fake money. Like, this isn't someone running at them with a knife or a gun and think there was a scuffle and then it went wrong. It's very clearly, it doesn't matter that he did something illegal if it's something like it's something so minor. The response should not have been to then kill this person in any situation, right? Like that's I think what everyone understands here, and that's another reason why it's such a clear example that has helped spark all of these protests and then riots and everything else we're going to discuss.
Yeah, moving on to the, you know, what that sparked, the reaction. Obviously, this is happening at a time where the other big news story in the world is Corona, and you have people on the streets trying to protest in that manner, and then you see the police response to those protests. Now, there have been, you know, there were acts of, you know, sort of people vandalizing police cars, police station with graffiti, and I know in particular the Minneapolis Police Department was the subject to, like, it was on fire essentially.
There is, I will find a photo to put in the show notes or a link to an article with one in, but it was a powerful image, and I think that happened overnight for us, because I think, like, I remember waking up and just seeing that image, and without any context, I was like, what's on fire? So yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful images from the very start of this.
And you see these protests juxtaposed with the police presence, which is incredibly heavy on the ground. You see people in riot shields with the full mast up, and I know when I saw those scenes, it looked like apocalyptic. That fire in the background with a policeman in that, you could see, you know, all the devastation caused, but you can do a direct contrast, I think, and this is where other people see a double standard with race in America and how you are treated if you are white and how you're treated if you are black. A few weeks earlier, you'd had those protests done by sort of people on the right who wanted the lockdown to stop because they wanted haircuts and they wanted to go back to work. And some of those people who were, you know, doing the protest were fully armed in military combat gear with not with AK-47s, but with, you know, assault rifles on their back. And the police presence to stop them storming buildings was no riot shields, nothing like that. You know, just kind of trying to, they formed a human barrier, but that was it. And then you contrast this with the response of people peacefully protesting, and the police have been quite heavy-handed. That seemed like a great sort of another hypocrisy of the way that the police treats people of color within the United States, or at least, you know, we're going to talk about how this spreads around the world. It's not just the United States that have this problem, but I think America has been put under a big spotlight with these events and with social media out there all the time. I think this was the first time that I really saw it filmed directly into my Twitter feed, and just the things that just made my jaw hit the floor as I was watching it on the feed, particularly within those first few weeks, were astounding. I mean, we can talk about a few of them. The one that stands out for me, probably the one that made the most press, was the arrest of the CNN reporter live on air.
Oh yeah. They were like in the middle of reporting, and they got arrested just for being nearby. Whereas, again, I don't have all the details to hand on that specific one, but I'm pretty certain there was several colleagues of theirs who were white saying, "Well, they didn't come up and arrest us; like they just let us be." And this person had the same press pass. So it's obviously targeting people. It's not targeting people based on proximity. It's targeting them clearly on the color of their skin in that situation, because, like, you have two people who are, obviously there as a news crew with passes, and the person who gets arrested is a black person. Well, it's like there's no way they've made the distinction on anything else here. And again, I think it's just consistent examples. Like, people talk about people waking up to this. I think people have been aware about systemic racism in certain ways. Different people have been aware in different ways, but this is such a clear set of obvious examples, like one after the other. And it's not like, we had a similar event in the UK back in 2011 when a young black man was shot, and we had riots in the UK. Lasted about a day or two. Like, it wasn't the same scale, but there's this consistent problem worldwide with structural racism and people being treated differently because of their color of their skin, and that has then, like, this has been thrown into sharp relief, I suppose is the correct way to say this. Like, these consistent examples of, like, here is a perfect textbook example of what is wrong, and it can't be ignored in the way it has been before. And I think the quote from Will Smith was, "This isn't new. It's just being filmed." Like, that's the difference with social media. You are seeing it spreading, and people can see it. And I think it's been very easy for white people in the past to be like, kind of dismiss things like this when it's been raised. And here it is, example. You can't ignore it.
Yeah, it's been one where the news cycle has, I think previously there may have been a tendency for people to move on. Like, there would be a protest and they go, and then the news cycle would move on to something else. But what's been so markedly different about these protests is the way that they have spread, and the way that police action seems to have only heightened the need for protests. Maybe if the police had been a little not so heavy-handed in their response, I think there is a good argument to say that, it may not have caught on like it did. But it's spread to every state in the United States now. And then across the weekend, it's spread to, France, Italy, the UK, all of these areas that have been in lockdown, all of these people that are saying, in the age of pandemic, should you go out and protest, you can try and keep 2 meter distance, but it's hard to stay safe. This is a cause where I think everybody's gone, no, this is more important. We have to go out. And I think that's in particular, we've had the report over in the UK that basically confirmed that people who are BAME are more likely to suffer the effects of coronavirus worse than people who are more well off, and that's for a variety of reasons. We talked about it before, didn't we? That they tend to.
We touched on it briefly, but criticizing ourselves here, we didn't touch on it enough at the time. We just kind of said, here's some reasons. Yeah, I mean, other people have covered it way better than we have in between, and it's like, but it is. Yeah, I know someone who works in one of the areas of London that's worse affected, and it's the numbers are stark, very clear. I think it's because I think the problem is people get het up on percentages, but if you look at, like, the difference in people dying, it's something like, if your risk of dying is double if you are BIPOC or BAME. I don't know what the term is we're supposed to be using right now. I think BAME is what we've been using in the UK, but BIPOC is the one I've seen used more internationally.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure on which one is the best one to use here. I know that government reports here use BAME. So people go, oh, well, it's only this percentage of black people dying. And you're like, well, I mean, firstly, you shouldn't dismiss people dying in that way. But secondly, it's double the percentage of the population who are black, which is obviously not good. That shows there is a stark difference between your chances if you're white and if you're not. And it's for a whole load of systematic reasons that we don't have time to go into right now with that to do with coronavirus, but because we're focusing on these protests. But yeah, like go and do the reading on that. Have a look at that government report because it's pretty damning.
Exactly. I think my end point was going to be there that you compare people going out for protesting compared to the people a week before going off to the beach because they were fed up of being in lockdown. I know which one I think is the more noble cause to break social distancing measures.
There's been a few posts doing the rounds today, which are like, oh, people will be complaining about a second peak and stuff. And it's like, well, remember, like there's the delay of coronavirus. So if you're seeing a peak now, it's not due to the protests. It's going to be due to the people who are on the beach, which, just going down to the beach to have a jolly is not the same thing. Like,
I should have started at the top of the show just to say that as, two middle-aged white guys, we are probably the least qualified to talk about these issues, but we will try our best.
Yeah, I mean, we should not be taking away space from Black voices or any minority voices at this time, but I think it's important that sometimes the only way another white person gets that something is a problem is when another white person tells them. So, this is a problem, people. I think that's very clear from the events of the last few weeks, and I would encourage everyone to go off and do reading around this topic, educate themselves. It's not the position of minorities to educate you on their plight. Like, that's putting all that effort onto minorities who are already having to deal with all these problems in addition. But there are lots of good resources that have done the rounds, and I've already compiled some to put into the show notes. So there'll be examples in there, some books to go read, some posts to go read, places you can donate. So I'm going to try and put as many resources or links to groups of resources in as I can. But yeah, no, we have to recognize that we are privileged people in this conversation. I saw a perfect cartoon kind of on this point where there's we have the movement Black Lives Matter, and a common retort to that in the past from white people who don't want to have to think about it is, oh, well, all lives matter, which I would like to think that all of our listeners would know is not okay to say. But I mean, yeah, like the point there is like, that's like saying, oh, well, let's save the rainforest. The rainforests are endangered. Well, what about all trees? I mean, no one does that. Like, it's just completely banal comparison. Banal's the wrong word. Completely incorrect comparison. So this is a problem that needs to be fixed. Everyone should be equal. And these systemic problems, it's going to take work and it's going to include work from white people to realize this is a problem that's been there and we've kind of been like brushed it under the rug. And I think maybe that's kind of tying into a point I was trying to say earlier, where like in the UK, we've generally thought like, oh, we're really good at this. Like we look over at America, well, America's worse than us, therefore we're good by comparison. But that very much brushes under the rug 400 years of colonial oppression, all of these things that are tied into our history. And I think maybe we can touch on this more later when we talk about people's use of the word racist to describe certain things. And I think like there's an inevitable bit of pain involved as a white person in understanding how you are better off because of how you were born, and it's just the luck of the draw, and other people are worse off because of that. And I don't think there's a way you can come to understand that without it feeling bad for you, and you have to deal with that at some point. Books go into way better in depth than I can in a podcast, so I'll put some links in the show notes, I suppose is all I'm going to say. But white people need to do the work to understand the problems that other people are going through. It's kind of my summary point. And again, I apologize to people that this is a bit of a rambly bit here.
No, it's all right. It's a very complex topic, and sometimes you've got to. I find myself talking these things out to myself. You're all learning along the way.
And I assure you, I came to this in my head. Oh, I've got the perfect points to make, and then the words come out of your mouth, and they don't live up to the gravity of the situation.
I get you there. Yeah, I think. Yeah, so we've talked about it being systemic and being within our institutions, both in the police force, but also within our democracies, and the way that we can, is democracy enough to solve this, or is this something that we can do by simply electing new leaders? And what happens when you feel that you're unable to write to your congresswoman or congressman in whichever state to make things change? One of the underlying factors in these riots is that people have felt a great deal of frustration about these things happening again and again and again, and nothing being done about it. So we talked about George Floyd being just one and the one that sparked these protests. But I've just dropped in the chat. There's a list of names of people who've all been on the wrong end of police oppression. I think some of the names I'm just going to bring out here. Trayvon Martin was that was back in 2012. That was a big case under Obama, where a neighborhood watch volunteer called George Zimmerman shot him and killed him. And what happened in that case is Zimmerman was acquitted of all charges and has since sued Trayvon Martin's family, which seems unjust for somebody killing an unarmed 17-year-old. There's Tamir Rice, who was shot and killed by a white police officer in Cleveland, even though he was just playing with a pellet gun. And the one that's been doing the rounds a lot on social media at the moment is Breonna Taylor, who was in bed when she was shot by Louisville detectives. They were serving a no-knock warrant in her home, which was basically, you don't have to knock and we can search your apartment. She was shot while she slept, and subsequently no drugs were found in her apartment. That's an issue that happened a while back, and none of the police officers involved in that have been charged for what would appear to be, reading that description of events, I'm not quite sure how you can see that as justified. So there have been plenty of these events in the past that people have felt powerless to make a difference, or they feel that, the police always come out on, walk free after those cases. So this was one that's demanded action, and people have taken direct action by going to the streets. And that's spilled out in lots of different ways, shapes and forms. And I think that's created a response from President Trump, who it's his duty as president to try and unite the nation. That's kind of the job of a president during these times, should be to lead. However, I think we can go on to discuss how he has been found wanting many of those areas, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should not surprise us based on what we've discussed about Trump in the past. But firstly, to your point about government, you said before we move on, I would recommend people listening to Left, Right and Center, the very good American political show where they have a center hosting it and then they have someone on the left and someone on the right. And they had an all-black panel on there, and it was very good. They had a black Republican Party member on there who had previously been fairly high up in the Republican Party, and had some anecdotes about how they were like, well, the reason you're here is because you're a black guy. And so go listen to that. It's important to go listen to those voices. And I can't remember if it was on that podcast or another podcast I was listening to where they were talking about Trump, and he has flailed with the virus. It's not something he can, like, strong man tactics do not work against a virus. And so he has definitely appeared weak against it. And I think in addition to the usual Trump problems, Trump has then gone, oh, well, I can be a strong man here. And that's where a lot of the problems have occurred, because I've listened to other shows where Americans have been saying it feels like we're having a civil war, like the idea that Trump would call in the federal, the National Guard, who are like a federal institution, to deal with these things, and in multiple places. And it very much feels to a lot of Americans now like their way of life is under attack because of Trump's actions.
Yeah. And his sort of calls to violence as well in some cases, which caught the ire of Twitter. So I'll read the tweet, the offending tweet, what's second half of one of his many Twitter ramblings or rants. I don't know which one is fairer, but these thugs, all capital letters, are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. I just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you.
And that's that was pointed out that's specifically a reference to, I think it was from the 1960s. It was said by a police commissioner when there were riots on the same issue, essentially, back then. This has been an long-going problem in American politics and worldwide politics. And he's just essentially quoting someone who was, derided, I think, at the time and definitely since for the same comments. So not at all a clever move to say that. There's a lot of times I feel like it should be obvious that we disagree with these things that are being said, but sometimes it's good to state it out loud.
Yeah, definitely. and that was one that was, Twitter deemed it that it violated its own rules about glorifying violence. And maybe I thought what was particularly tin-eared about Donald Trump's response is that he immediately went on the attack for Twitter and quickly published an executive order against social media companies sort of censoring people in the future, or, should have had a warning shot across their bows to say, do this again and I'll really do something, which I think is incredibly frustrating to think that, the president has a lot of power in those executive orders, but he only seems to wield it when it directly affects him. He could have, you think of all the things in the world, that were going on at that time that he could have done, except he devotes his time and energy to that, which seems to be very much a personal thing between him and @Jack at Twitter. Yeah, just seemed to me particularly, I mean, it won't be the first time we're talking about Trump, maybe not quite grasping the gravity of the situation, but I thought that was the first in a long line of mistakes from Donald Trump about how he's handled this crisis.
And just before we move on there, I believe either essentially the same text or he has an auto tweet to Facebook. I don't know exactly how it's set up, but the same comments were made on Facebook, and Facebook did not censor it or put anything. I mean, to be clear, Twitter didn't take it down. They just said, I think one of the things he got fact checked on, and the other thing was, and by fact checked, I mean it said, this may not be true, here's a link, as opposed to saying this is wrong. And then with that tweet, I believe they covered it up and said this may be, distressing to people or whatever the exact text is. Facebook has done nothing to that regard, and I think it's a clear example of the difference between these different social media companies, because Mark Zuckerberg went and had a meeting with Trump and afterward was kind of like, no, it's all okay. And it's like, I think everyone else is watching saying, why aren't you acting on this at Facebook? And Facebook has this kind of everything is open. It's a kind of free speech defense where it's like, well, everything is open, so there can be anything here. But also at the same time, Facebook does take down other stuff. You can say critical. I can't. There are better examples out there than I can bring to mind right now. But there are examples of times where Facebook has been like, "Oh, well, you can't possibly say that. That's offensive. That's hate speech." When it wasn't. It's just someone talking about their life or something. And then when it's something like that, they're just like, "Oh no, it's fine for the president."
It was particularly fact checking. I think Facebook were brought up on and didn't act, which led to a string of joke headlines which said something along the lines of child molester Mark Zuckerberg doesn't believe in fact checking on Facebook, which was kind of like, you're not going to take down this post, Mark Zuckerberg, because we can say whatever we want because that's your policy, trying to target the man directly. And I know that there have been stories within Facebook that's caused somewhat of a tension at the top with executives there believing that Mark Zuckerberg is wrong on this one. So we may see a change in Facebook if that happens, but certainly at the time, it's another hot button issue that was brought up at this time. And when facts are everything, and you'd hope that social media have some responsibility in that way. It's a little worrying to see that Facebook isn't following suit.
I think there might going to be a lot of show notes for this one. There's, I think that was much better covered by the Rocket podcast, which is a tech podcast, which basically went to town on Trump about this. So yeah, I can point you in that direction. Yeah, I suppose the other thing that has been mentioned, so there was Mattis, who I think we touched on in one of the very early episodes of this podcast when he stepped down. He was previously the defense secretary, I think. Yep.
Known as Mad Dog Mattis. So
yeah, and this is definitely someone who was not opposed to violence, let's put it that way. And one of the things I saw discussed is that if you're one of these kind of highly respected generals, you get your one opportunity to play your political piece when you're retired to basically be like, this is not okay. And he has held his tongue a long time through the Trump presidency. And it was at this point that he came out and said, no, this is just, yeah, I will post in the chat, and there is a going to be in the show notes. But yeah, essentially the TLDR is described him as a threat to the Constitution, which is the title of that article. Yeah, it's pretty damning. And from someone who you would imagine is, a rooting, tooting kind of Republican character to come out and say that. Like, the Republicans have been fairly behind Trump throughout all of this. But yeah, it's a dissenting voice from that side.
Yeah. And I think the fact that he pointed out that he felt that Trump was trying to divide America rather than unite it at this time of crisis kind of feeds into what many people have perceived as Trump's tactic at this time. Trump has an election coming up in November, one that he's by no means certain of winning. And one of the tactics is by turning rural areas of the country against the cities. These protests are very city-based. It's, the nature of, where these, of what's happened and where people are most affected by these issues. So Trump, in his tweets and his stress on law and order and control, is trying to say that this isn't my fault as president, this is the fault of weak Democratic mayors. What you need is a strong federal government to bring law and order. I am that man, and if the weak Democratic mayors can't sort it out, I'll send in the National Guard, I'll send in the feds. And he invoked an obscure part of the Constitution, I believe, to do this, saying that, he has the power to do that, even if these mayors don't agree to this help. And that seemed, I've talked about how his other responses were particularly tin-eared. This one was another one where you felt a lot of people were complaining that the police were acting in too militaristic a fashion, and the fact that the police were enforcing curfews, using rubber bullets, using tear gas to disperse protesters was actually leading to increased tensions rather than letting them simmer down. And on the same day that he announces this military response, he decides that he's going to walk from the White House to St. John's Church, which is a little way across, for essentially a photo opportunity. But between him and this photo opportunity are protesters who are outside the White House. So you have these bizarre scenes where the police use tear gas on peaceful protesters to clear the way so Trump can have a photo outside a church holding up a Bible, which to many people seems hypocritical. Trump has a strong support amongst evangelical Christians in particular, but I think you would struggle to say that Trump is a man who abides by those same rules that those voters do. And the way that it was reported, I remember reading it on BBC News, and the headline was essentially Trump's used tear gas against his own people for photo opportunity. That was the headline, which it's not. The BBC is usually a little bit more neutral in its response, or, the tear gas line might be the second or third paragraph of what happened, but to put it up there really stressed how a lot of people were looking at this event and felt, oh, this is a terrible response from the president.
I think the other point there is, or kind of a continuation of that point really, is that, it didn't seem very well planned. Apparently, he decided he wanted to do it just after he'd given his speech, so he kind of ended his speech on and now I'm off to the church. But it's not like he went over there to pray or to talk to the religious leaders at all. He just kind of went over there and held a Bible. And I don't know if you've seen this footage, but it is bizarre. He just kind of stands around for 2 minutes holding a Bible. It's not like he gets out and reads, a passage. You could see a situation where another president who wouldn't have tear gassed their own people would have said, gone over there, opened it up and read something along the lines of, I don't have one to hand, but, could have read some kind of calming speech from the Bible or something. But no, he just kind of stands there with it awkwardly as a photo opportunity. And that's clearly what it is. He didn't even say anything. He just kind of stands around holding the Bible in a weird way. It's like he's completely disconnected from what's going on. And I think that's the thing we've said before about Trump's response to things. But here it was just so bizarre and it made no sense. Yeah, I just don't understand. I'm sorry. I don't have the words for it. I just don't understand. It was just so weird and so badly thought out.
And it was even condemned by religious leaders after he'd done it. I believe, the bishop of the church in particular that he went to, he said, well, nobody invited him there, and all of these raft of reasons why it was a bad idea. It just, I don't think it did him any favors. And in the long term, it's another one of those moments where you look back at this crisis and go, this is a president who seems, as you said, detached from the situation. One of the other reasons why he may have decided to walk over there was there had been reports earlier that he'd gone down to a bunker while there were protests going on, and he'd been labelled on social media as a bunker baby, because he may have feared that the White House would have been accosted by protesters. So this may have been another way of his way of saying, I'm not afraid of anybody, I can walk wherever I please in Washington, D.C. However, the fact he had to do that by clearing those peaceful protesters with tear gas somewhat undermined his point. There's a lot of reasons why Trump does these things, and you mentioned right at the start that he's a strongman leader. He's trying to take control of the situation in the only way that he knows how. The problem is that is a terrible way of taking control in this situation that demands a much more measured approach. And it's led to a lot of people. I know that all the major news networks, apart from Fox, ran the Obama response to it, which I believe was sort of tied in with the class of 2020 speeches that were going on. But people have looked to previous presidents for words of wisdom rather than the current one, because they do feel that he is unable to give the leadership required in this situation to invoke any change, when all he can seem to say at this point is, I'll make the police stronger, which is exactly the point many of the people on the street are protesting so strongly against.
Before we move on to the worldwide impact of this, one thing I want to touch on is, on the contrast, how Biden has responded, because obviously there's a general election coming up in the US at the end of the year. So how do you contrast Trump's approach with Biden's approach? I mean, I think one of the clear things is, like, today Biden went to visit George Floyd's family. I don't think Trump has even considered doing something like that.
I'm seeing it through the scope of social media, a lot of my American politics. And Biden is still quite a controversial figure within Democratic ranks, or particularly on the left. Those who wanted Bernie to win still see Biden as somewhat of a liability, and some of the things that Biden has come out and said, I know that he's also come out and said, no, we're not going to defund the police, because he doesn't feel that's an election-winning platform. However, it's one of the things that might actually help what's going on the ground. Saw a tremendous thing about John Oliver about this. I'll touch on it very briefly, but this idea of defunding the police is, to the ears, it sounds quite radical, and you can perceive it, or those on the right will have you believe that it means completely disband the police force and have a lawless zone where, anybody can do crimes because the police doesn't exist. But what that rallying cry actually says is, take a look at the budgets that each state applies to their police department, and the police have a massive budget compared to education, mental health services, social services, etc., etc. And one of the ideas about defunding the police is that you take some of that money away from the police and put it into structural elements such as mental health services or, social services. And that, in a way, takes away the need for as much policing, because you are stopping the crimes before they happen. If you defund those institutions, the mental health institution, then you will have more crimes that are influenced by mental health on the street, etc., etc. So I think on that issue, Biden has not quite caught up with Trump. But as you said, in a leadership perspective, the way that he's going to, speak with George Floyd's family, the Democrats are very clearly, that there was all the congressmen and women knelt for 8 minutes and 46 seconds the other day in the House, which seems very, that is at least a symbol of which side they stand with.
Yeah. But on the flip side, the Republicans, when they've been approached, have been like, oh, well, I haven't seen the news yet. I'm sorry, I'm off to lunch. Stuff like that, which just doesn't fly, I'm afraid.
Yes. So the Democrats' response is, better than Republicans, but they've got a long way to go. And there are people out there who say, don't like what's happening out, don't like the way that Trump is dealing with this. You can change it. Go and vote in 2020 for Joe Biden. And for a lot of people who are on the streets who've been affected by this, they come back and say, look, these things were happening under a black president when I voted him in 2012. Voting doesn't always solve these issues. And although I would like to solve it democratically, you force my hand and I have to make other statements to try and make sure that this happens. it means that people's faith in the Democratic Party to actually enact maybe some of the more radical reforms that are required, people don't believe that as much. So, yeah, in summary, Biden doing a better job than Trump, but that's maybe not saying much when Trump has set such a low bar.
So moving on to this worldwide spread of these protests, we mentioned several other countries where they're happening, but I think we're now going to hone in at home in the UK. So as this has come closer to home, we've had the first proper protest this weekend just gone, and some people raised concerns about coronavirus and people going out in second spike, and I know we've already touched on that, but I think the words of one of the organisers of the protests, a young black person, said, "We have a pandemic of black people dying every day," and I just think that stands for itself. There's nothing else I can say really. I will make sure the link to that full interview is in the show notes. But yeah, people need to stand up and do something about this. People, as from what I've seen, people have been doing their best with the social distancing. It's not like people are completely ignoring it because they want to go out and protest, which I think is how some people are trying to spin this. There are people trying their best to maintain social distancing. I saw a few friends in Manchester who were out doing the protests, with their placards, and they shared photos, and as much as possible from within. This is the thing with crowds. When you look at a crowd from a distance, it does look huge and one blob. But when you're in a crowd, you can actually see how much space is between people. So I think that the difference is often you're seeing photos shared from social media of people actually in the protest and how far apart they're trying to be. And then you see pictures from outside the protest, and it looks like a horde of people who are all hugging, essentially. And so I think that's one thing where, it's important to bear that in mind. I'm not saying that people can easily maintain social distancing while in a protest, but people are definitely trying. It's not like people are forgetting about it.
But part of me also thinks that it's so long since I've seen a crowd that the idea of 10 people together makes me go, or, crowd.
I agree with you. It's life is weird now. So seeing a group of people doing something fairly normal, which is getting together in a larger group, maybe not. I mean, we had protests that were not related to this prior to the pandemic. So, it's weird to think a year ago or so people were doing equivalent marches for things like Brexit and for the environment. And it's just kind of not been a part of life for 2 months or so. But yeah, I think the overall point is that that's not the thing to focus on here. The thing to focus on is that there is a problem here and it needs to be fixed. And we, as we've touched on a bit already, we are not absolved of this in the UK. It's not a US only problem. This is a systemic, worldwide problem of institutionalized racism that needs to be dealt with. And I think the thing I wanted to touch on here is that I've seen a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, I'm not a racist," or stuff like that. And I think it's a hard thing to explain sometimes to people. And I have been loath to explain this to people on social media when I've seen posts along these lines, because I don't think I'm going to get through to someone in text generally with something like this. This is something where it's easier to talk to someone face to face. And when people have tried to say stuff like that, it's so the definitions of words change all the time, but also there are the ways that different cultures use words. And in a globalized world where we're all on the internet, it's very easy to misconstrue someone's meaning when they say something. So firstly, the point I tried to make up front, people are conflating the American police forces with our police forces in a lot of these discussions. That's not to say that there aren't institutionalized racism problems everywhere, but also equally the way our police forces run is different. I think there was a post from a police officer saying, if you want to change it, come and sign up for the police, be a police officer. And yes, that is one way to tackle it. But I think that post started off by saying, "Oh, well, I'm a police officer and I'm not a racist." And that's missing the point. We're all brought up to think that, or at least I'd like to think everyone I know was brought up to go, racism is bad. These words are bad. You can't say these things. You can't treat people differently for the color of their skin. And so everyone's like, "Oh, well, we're not racist," because we were told not to be racist. But that misses the point of this systemic, institutionalized problem. So there are much better ways of explaining this than I'm probably going to try to do now. I will try to put some links in as well. But the point being that if you're born white, you have a privilege in life. You start off higher up the kind of social totem pole, as it were. It's a really bad metaphor, but yeah, you get the point. Like, it's a privilege, and white privilege is one of the biggest privileges. There are other privileges, being straight, being cisgendered, being rich. All of these are other privileges that people have, but they are not. Lacking one privilege does not like outweigh your other privilege, and generally, white privilege is one of the biggest ones. So, due to how an accident of history, it's like the point here is not saying it is your fault that racism has happened. The point is saying that there is systemic racism, and you, white person, whoever you are, what you can do here is realize that this exists and act to get rid of it. It's that, like, what's that famous quote? The famous quote is, all that it takes for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing. And that's exactly what this is here. Similar things you see with, like, the wage gap in jobs. Well, it's illegal for women to be paid less for the same job, right? So they must have the same salaries. Job done. That's not true. Because of systemic problems where women, have to deal with the majority of the childcare, because we still have these old-fashioned views about how families work embedded in our culture, and you have differences in how, like, it's how you go for a promotion and things like that. No one, it is illegal to inherently discriminate, but discrimination still happens, and I think that's a distinction people need to understand. And I hope I've explained that to some people who hadn't understood it properly before, and so other people have explained it way better than I have. That's why there's going to be a load of resources in the show notes. But yeah, that's the point I want to make here.
You did a fantastic job, if I may say so.
I hope so. I mean, I've been reading books. So that is the problem, fundamentally. I think people need to think, like, the way humans respond to a criticism is to feel personally attacked. And that's where you get these things like, all lives matter, etc. coming up. And that's not the point. Don't focus on that. Focus on the fact there are problems in the system that we need to fix. That's what you're focusing on. And probably a good example here is, so we were talking about the protests. So in Bristol, one of the protests went past a statue. And this statue is a statue of, I'm not going to mention his name, but he was a slave trader in the 1600s, I believe, and helped donate to almshouses and stuff in Bristol. So the kind of the inflection point here is that during the protest, this statue was taken down and thrown into the river because it was a symbol of slavery and all these bad things that we're fighting against. And obviously some people said, well, I don't think anyone said in this moment that I've seen. I'm sure someone did on Twitter, but, like, in the news, no one was saying, oh, well, we should have kept it up. But in the past, there have been petitions to bring this down for precisely these reasons. And it's just not happened. And I think that speaks to your point where it's like, one of the problems within democracy is when there's a correct minority. If that's a good way of looking at it, maybe. So, like,
I think what you're trying to say, there's, like, one of the points that's made around the taking down of this statue is about morality and legality. Okay? So, to rip down a statue in a public place and throw it in the river is illegal.
Yes.
Okay? The police can't condone that sort of behaviour because we can't all go ripping down private property that we don't like.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's why people like the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and others have said, this was done in the wrong way. And in the case of the Home Secretary and other people, they've said, like, we need to prosecute the people who did this. However, there's a very strong, moral side for saying, actually, with our 21st century morality, why did we have a statue up for a renowned slave trader anyway? We have made the decision to, get rid of things like this in the past.
And I think this is the point I was kind of trying to get to, is that I'm sure there are people out there who disagree, but yeah, I think, as you say, it's a moral point. We wouldn't build a statue to a known slave trader today. Therefore, we should get rid of them. And petitions have been made, and people have been like, "Oh, it's part of the city." That, like, the kind of the arguments against the kind of whataboutisms and like weasel words, or not really focusing on the issue here, that, like, people have to walk past that every day, and it is a symbol of the oppression they were faced with. and that's not okay. Like, just because it doesn't affect you doesn't mean that that's okay. So we would generally, I think, I'd like to think all the listeners would agree that such statutes should be taken down. But I think this is a perfect example of that kind of point that was raised earlier about how, like, people have tried doing all the correct things. That's air quotes there if you can't hear them, like, that, you know, going through the procedure, doing with the courts. And that's what was kind of this spark over in America, because here was a man who said, you know, yes, he did something illegal at the start, but then during the, you know, he was like, I can't breathe. He was like, he was trying to free himself, but he wasn't like, you know, he wasn't like attacking them with a knife or anything. And people have gone through the courts before, as you said. You mentioned all those people who've been killed in America unjustly, and justice has not been served to their families, and those officers involved in those incidents got away with it. And this is the same kind of example where the reason some of the protests in some situations have turned into riots in the US, and the reason that some damage has happened here, is because sometimes you just need to do a thing to get something started. For years and years, people have been talking about various statues around the UK. I know there's one in Oxford where people talk about it should be taken down. There's this one in Bristol that had multiple campaigns to get rid of it, and it had not gone away. One of those topples, and then suddenly they all come down because here's a tweet from BBC London News getting rid of one in London Docklands today. Like, that one incident was enough to convince all these people that actually, yes, we should do that thing we should have done ages ago.
One of those we've talked about, people not, you know, trying to go through the correct channels, as you said. People had tried with this statue not to get it removed, just have a plaque added that said, by the way, this statue of this bloke, he did really bad things with slaves and would only give, you know, although he was a philanthropist, he'd only give his charity to people who ascribed to his religion and his political view. That was what they wanted to add. They weren't even talking about taking it down, but the compromise couldn't be found at a council or local level, or, you know, it only took one or two people to stand in the way of that to stop it happening. And is that really democracy if it takes a few people to stop things like that? So, yeah, I think the statue has been the flashpoint over here, and that's been the subject of most debate, really. And it's a bit sad in a way, maybe, that you'd rather it be talked about what's happening over in America with, you know, and you know, police oppression and other things, you know, like that. But I believe, at least with this statue, it's ignited a conversation about Britain's colonial past and how we deal with it, and how that has been brushed aside by, I think a point we made earlier was that we look over at America and say, whoa, well, at least we're not as bad as they are over there. So that means we're not racist, and we have to have a good book on
the Victorians.
Precisely. Yeah. It forgets about all of our bad stuff just because we've got somebody else to point the finger at. And yeah, I think this particular statue debate, and as you're saying, it's having an effect right now with other prominent slavers being removed, their statues being removed throughout the UK, that people have sort of gone, yeah, we should have done this a long time ago.
Coming back to the structural racism point, a big problem we have in this country is that it was never taught in any of my history classes. Like, I don't think we even touched on slavery at all up to GCSE. I didn't do GCSE history. I know that there was a lot of World War One involved GCSE history, or was it World War Two? But like, it just didn't come up in that context at all. And I appreciate it's a thing that can be hard to teach to children, but like, there needs to be we did something bad.
I think your point is basically like, why do we learn so much about Henry VIII's 6 wives? Maybe we should actually learn about something that matters, like slavery.
Yes. No, I think that's true. I mean, for similar point for Henry VIII, you know, Henry VIII's 6 wives, you learn about Henry VIII, you learn that he had 6 wives, you learn the rhyme. You don't actually learn much about their stories. It's more about the white man view of history, the great man view of history, where it's like, oh, Henry VIII was this great man who, because he wanted to get divorced, broke away from the church, which actually, you know, is almost Trumpian in its kind of like ridiculousness. But yeah, like, I mean, there are points to be raised about that as well. There's a brilliant musical called Six, which is from the perspective of the 6 wives, that I would encourage people to go see. But yeah, that's my point. Like, like the only time we got close to touching it was in senior school. We had a religious studies class where we watched the movie Gandhi. Problematic because Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi and not an Indian person. Even then, we didn't really touch on why it was happening. Like, I'm sure that movie does, you know, because he goes on his fast, and there's the various strikes and peaceful protests they go through. The main point there is like, go away, Britain, you're ruling India, and that's kind of like the summary of it. Like, I don't think it's explored in the depth it should be, and I definitely don't think we ever explored that at school in a way that was in any way valuable. It shouldn't be the case that within our system of education, you only start to kind of even look at those things when you're at university. Because I appreciate there's probably an angle where people are like saying, oh, well, we should protect the kids. But like, no, it's important. Like, bad stuff has happened in the past. Like, we don't, we would condemn the Romans for slavery. I know that we talked about the Romans and slavery. So why can't we talk about the fact that it was also a problem with the UK and colonialism and all of that? Like, yeah, that's a simple fix. Change the curriculum. That's one thing we should do so that at least newer citizens coming up through the process are educated.
I can say, speaking from personal experience as a graduate of history and politics, it's amazing how little of that stuff that matters you cover. It's like you say, it's the white great man view of history. It's Churchill and Stalin and wars and the actions of politicians rather than the social history that matters, and other elements around it. That colonial side of Britain's empire, all of that. That's it gets brushed away, or you just simply don't cover it. It's not part of your curriculum, so why bother learning it? Which is a terrible thing to. You have to do the reading yourself if you want to find out about that stuff, which is awful. And the fact that it even happened in my university years says something about our current system of education, I feel.
I know we have deviated slightly from the point, and I think that's because it's clear here we have thoughts on this, and we're trying to do better ourselves, as well as trying to suggest ways that our country can do better at this. Speaking of kind of the response at the national level, I know you touched on Priti Patel and stuff like that. I think you've got some notes about Matt Hancock talking about cabinet, which is, it's better than it was. It's not entirely white men now, but what was it Matt Hancock had to say on the cabinet? Because I don't think I'm up to speed on that.
It was just an excruciating 2 minutes and 22 seconds of him being interviewed by somebody on Sky saying, how many black members of cabinet have you got? And he responds by saying, well, we've got Priti Patel and Sunak in our cabinet. And the person says, no, my question was specifically black members of your cabinet. To which the answer is 0, none. And he brings up the fact that there was a black member of cabinet that was under Boris Johnson's previous administration before Boris did a reshuffle and sacked them, which maybe isn't the best response to that. And it's just a very excruciating 2 minutes and 22 seconds. And the right answer there is to say, no, we haven't got any black members in our cabinet. We must strive to do better and improve that. The fact that the government it's not unique to our government at the moment, but it appears to be for a lot of politicians, particularly within the Johnson administration, they can't seem to give a straight answer to an honest question and have to dance around it, particularly on this issue, was incredibly frustrating. And there have been other frustrations within the Johnson government where I was watching PMQs last week and Keir Starmer brings up Black Lives Matter and says that, essentially tells Boris that his mate in the White House, Donald Trump, has had an awful response. Do you want to condemn Trump's actions or do anything, along those lines? And Johnson stays silent or avoids that issue on the whole. And because he doesn't want to be seen to be speaking against Trump, which shouldn't be the priority here. Your priority should be to say, yes, of course, Black Lives Matter, and the things that Trump has said are awful, and we need to do much better as a society. But I felt that wasn't forthcoming in PMQs because he's got another political agenda behind all of that, which is trying to stay chummy with the person in power in the United States. Just little elements like that, which have been, from a UK perspective, I keep saying it, but it's frustrating. The fact that our newspapers were dominated by the fact that the people who tore the statue down would be prosecuted rather than the reason why that statue was torn down is, it shows how the media frames these things and how it appeals to certain elements of its audience. It doesn't help that you have provocateurs in the form of Nigel Farage, calling people who tore the statue down the woke Taliban, which is
oh wow,
the most.
I hadn't heard that, but I mean,
it's him and Brendan O'Neill.
I'm going to beat myself here. So cover your ears. But I mean, he right off.
Yes, exactly. An absolutely terrible turn of phrase, but it was kind of satisfying to see him be ripped to shreds on Good Morning Britain.
Rightly so. Yeah, no,
two female professors handed it to. Yeah,
there's always a bigger racist.
I love that bit in Star Wars Episode 1. There's always a bigger racist.
Sorry. So I suppose moving on from that point, what was Boris's response to the protests and to the statue being pulled down?
Boris Johnson's response to this, saying that the anti-racism protests were subverted by thuggery, and accused basically of those that acted violently as a betrayal to the protesters' cause. Now, we've talked in length about how people feel frustrated and that's the only way they feel they can act. There are other people who've been spoken about. The subverted by thuggery comment is also one that's imbued with a racial connotation, that you only use thugs against black people, rather than if it had been a white protest, then it would have been a very different word being used. So again, the response from the government really has been, we respect your right to protest, but don't do it violently. And actually, I feel if you do it violently, then you are going against the whole meaning and message of this protest, which is something I completely disagree with. Yeah, Boris's response has been very different to other people on the political spectrum, and of course they are talking to their own political camps in these manners. The mayor of Bristol, who was talking about the statue, came down, basically said, yes, it was the right time to do so, and even though they preferred it was done democratically, they're not against the way that it happened. It was probably time that it came down. So, yeah, Johnson's response has been less than perfect, I would say, but it's not the outright horror show that Trump's has been. But there I go, comparing us to other countries again and saying, at least it's not as bad as over there. Where I should still underline and say, yeah, it's still a bad response in my opinion.
And I one thing actually, while we're still touching on the protests in the UK and talking about structural things, I know one thing that people have issue with and would like to see repealed is the Section 35 dispersal orders that the police have had since 2014. So it's a relatively new law, but basically I think the term of the law is that if they think a group of people who are over the age of 10 have suspicion that antisocial behaviour is going to happen, they can issue a dispersal order and then have heightened powers after that. So that's like one of these laws that may have been brought in with the best of intentions, a set of powers for the police that may have been brought in with the best set of intentions, but when it's being used to disperse peaceful protests and things like that, it's not being used as it should. I have only just started finding out about this in detail, so I wouldn't take my word as gospel on this at all, but maybe go and do some reading on that and see if it's something you think should be repealed. But it sounds like the kind of thing that is a perfect example of where a rule is put in place without the greater consequences being thought of, and I think that's often the problem that happens. There's precedent and stuff within laws that I can't speak to, not being a lawyer, but like there's a concept from maybe this is a bit of a facetious example perhaps, but there's the concept in rules for role-playing games and board games of rules as written and rules as intended. You can get away with a lot of things by a reading of the rules as written, and there are laws like that that need to be reanalyzed, and maybe we go, well, that's like this law is not being used in the way it was intended, and because the way it's now being used is technically within the letter of the law, but that doesn't mean it's okay. As I say, I've only recently found out about the specifics of Section 35, and I have not fully read on it, but that's probably a good place to start, things like that. So educating yourselves, educating your children, educating your friends on things, and looking into things like this that, more draconian laws that are not helping in situations like this, I think are the things to kind of focus on. as I say, there's going to be a whole load of resources in the show notes, probably the longest set of show notes we've ever written, I think, judging by the sheer number of links I've been coming across and want to throw in links to books, etc. So I don't know if you want to add some closing thoughts, Rob, before we move on, but yeah, there'll be a lot of resources there.
Yeah, no, I think basically to sum up what you've said and on the show notes, the thing that we can take away, or the thing that I've had to take away, as I mentioned up top, as a white middle-aged man, that's a lot of privileges just stacked up right there. It's my duty to go out there and educate myself and get better as a person to make sure I can be an effective ally in these situations. And so read those show notes, go out there and educate yourself, listen to People of Colour's podcasts. All the resources out there. That's one of the great things about what's happened over the last couple of weeks, is that sharing of information online and where you can go to educate yourself has just exploded. And there's people on my social media feed doing it every day. And it's wonderful to see. So it's about keeping that momentum up now. The protests haven't gone away yet, and I hope that they're able to keep that pressure up, but it's up to us to keep them going. So yeah, that's my little sum up. It's not much, but yeah, it's all I feel I can do at this moment in time.
Well, we try to end on a lighter note normally. I'm not sure we really can. I just think focus on hope for the future and the things you can do to help people. If you are a white person, a person with any kind of privilege, try and analyze that privilege. And if you're someone who has been affected by all these things and needs this help stronger than ever, I hope there is the feeling that there is a voice that people are trying to understand and trying to help and trying to work towards this. Even if it's, it can't come soon enough, I suppose, is a better way of ending that. There needs to be change, and it needs to happen now. We need to try and help as much as we can. I normally do an outro here, but you know where to find our stuff. You're listening to this podcast. There are links in the show notes. I don't think there's anything else to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
Bye.